My guest is an internationally renowned author, public speaker, and grief therapist. She's written several books, including her latest called Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief, which is available where books are sold. Her name is Claire Bidwell Smith. Claire, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
It's nice to talk to you this morning. We talked off the air, but we have some things in common that aren't necessarily the greatest things to have in common, but we're going to relate to each other during this conversation. So when someone chooses to devote their life to grief therapy, I'm sure that personal experiences are the catalyst for that. And in your case, I understand you were 14 years old and not one, but both of your parents were diagnosed with cancer. Of course, I lost my father and my sister to cancer. I can completely relate to this. Do you mind talking about your parents and what happened?
Yeah. But yes, you're right. This is not what I imagined doing when I grew up. I did not, dream of being a grief counselor. So it does come from a very personal place. You're right. When I was 14, both of my parents got cancer within months of each other. And then my mother died when I was 18 and my dad when I was 25. I'm an only child. So it was like this decade of hospitals and ups and downs and maybes and, a lot of heartbreak and a lot of illness. And so there I was at 25, very alone in the world, but more than anything, I was in this position that most of my peers were not.
Yes.
They were all kind of post-college, living their, beginning adult lives, living in new apartments and relationships and their first jobs after school. And I was like, what is the meaning of life? Why is this happening? Why am I here? What happens next? So it kind of set me off on a different trajectory than most of my friends.
Now, your first book was called The Rules of Inheritance, and that was your memoir about navigating life as a woman alone in her mid-20s. Life's hard enough, as you just said. Life is hard enough, in normal times, especially at that age when you're just kind of trying to start to figure things out. Here you were, you're alone dealing with this trauma. Can you talk about your ability to cope at that time? Like, how were you able to cope as a young woman, in your mid-20s, at a time, again, when people are just starting to figure things out?
Yeah, I had some really good coping skills and some really bad ones. The thing I did want to be when I grew up was a writer. I've loved writing and books since I was a little kid. And I think as an only child, it was kind of lonely. So I would just read all the time and books were my constant companion. So when my parents got sick, I really turned towards writing. I wrote all the time. I wrote about how I felt. I wrote about what was happening. And that really saved me on many levels. But then I had other coping skills that were not great, like destructive relationships with men, booze, traveling, just things, nothing terrible,
Yep.
But things that just weren't great and didn't help my life. And I found myself finally really just in need of some help by my late 20s. And I went to therapy myself.
Oh.
I discovered meditation, yoga. Those things really helped me. I had been kind of running from what I had been through for a long time, like trying to escape it in any way possible. When I finally learned how to sit with it, I began to heal. And once I really began to heal, I decided I wanted to go back and help others. Loss really changes how you see the world. And I'm sure you know this, it makes you figure out what's meaningful and what's not. And so suddenly all these things, like I was writing for all these cool magazines and I was reviewing restaurants and hotels, and that seems awesome, but it suddenly felt so meaningless in the face of what I understood about the world. So I wanted to do something that kind of meant something more than that.
Interesting. So did you go back to school then in order to?
I did. I went back and I got my master's in clinical psychology.
Okay.
And so then I became a therapist. I worked in hospice first. My father had been in hospice when he died, and we'd had a really good experience with that. Mm-hmm. So nobody in my grad program wanted to work in death and dying or hospice. Like that was nobody's choice. And so I thought, wow, if there are so few of us who want to work in that space, I should definitely do it so that I can be helpful.
Lots of opportunity too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, after your mom passed, I understand that you suffered panic attacks and you ended up in the emergency room more than once. And nobody could connect the dots at that time. The doctors, they weren't sure what the problem was. They were questioning if it was a physical ailment. And it wasn't until later that you kind of figured out that it was anxiety brought on by that family trauma. And you kind of ended up self-diagnosing yourself later. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I started to have a lot of anxiety before and especially after my mother died. And yeah, I ended up in the ER more than once. Anxiety can manifest in such real physical symptoms. I mean, it has such an impact on our physiology. Our heart rates go up, our adrenaline, all our stress hormones. We can have all kinds of real feelings that seems like something's happening to you. So I kept getting into that space. And at the time, I think there was a lot less focus on how we are affected by things that are going on in our lives. So never once did the doctors ask me, what's happening? Is there anything going on that would maybe cause you to be freaking out?
They never asked you that.
No, they asked me if I was doing drugs. They asked me, like, they hooked me up to everything. They took blood tests and then they just told me I was 1 out of 10 people that has heart palpitations. I was like, great.
Wow.
So it was later when I was taking psychology classes and I was specifically reading about PTSD that I really started to connect the dots. Not that I had PTSD necessarily, but I suddenly began to realize that my anxiety stemmed directly from my experiences of losing my parents.
Mm-hmm. Now, the connection between anxiety and grief, as a therapist, you've seen this a lot in your clientele, I imagine. How do they treat a situation like this when it goes from, I guess, starting out as a mental issue and then becoming a physical one?
Yeah, it's kind of chicken or the egg sometimes. It's an interesting, anxiety is kind of a slippery beast, and it can really become insidious and pile up on itself. People can get anxious about having anxiety. Yeah. And when it's related to loss, it can come on in 2 different ways. Either you can never have had anxiety in your life, and then you go through a big loss like you did, and suddenly you just realize how precarious life is, how fallible our bodies are, how anything can change at any moment. Mm-hmm. And it suddenly blooms this new sense of anxiety. Then there are people who already had anxiety. They go through a loss. It makes it much worse. Mm-hmm. The 2 things I've really discovered, nobody was talking about the connection of grief and anxiety several years ago. And I wrote an article about it that was online. And I got more responses to that article than any book I've written. It was like, everybody was emailing me and they were like, is this real? Really? Grief and anxiety, is this a real thing? My dad just died and I'm having panic attacks or whatnot. And so then that was what spurred me on to write the book. And I've had so many clients now come to me with this that I've really gotten to study it and what the links are. And I really see in working with it, there's a twofold thing that needs to happen. A lot of the anxiety comes from not being with your grief, repressing it, pushing it away, trying to just move on. Grief needs to be sat with, as I learned myself, in my late 20s, when I had just been trying as best I could to get away from it. It was still there waiting for me. Mm-hmm. And when we push it down and we ignore it, it always spills out in anger, anxiety, depression. So that's one part of the piece that needs to happen, is kind of really working with the grief. When a client comes to me experiencing this, I'm always like, okay, well, where are you with your grief? How much have you let yourself feel it? Are you stuck anywhere with it? Is there anything you're, ruminating on that you feel guilty about, or you wish you could have done differently or mm-hmm. said? So there's always pieces there that are part of this. And then the other piece is just doing some cognitive work around anxiety. Anxiety is a series of thoughts that are fearful, that set off a reaction in our bodies. So learning how to move around your thoughts is really key to this.
I've heard you make reference to hypochondria, and which is the fear of having a serious illness. And I'm going to be honest, and I've never really talked about this. So when my father passed, he was 80 years old. He had a lot of other health issues. And so I had sadness, but I didn't really have anxiety or anything because it was almost expected in a way. When my sister passed at 49, that really impacted me. And to this day, if I feel any kind of pain for more than a few days, in the back of my mind, I start thinking, you know what I mean? And,
yeah, absolutely.
And so that, I guess, is something that you probably come across a lot too.
Yes, it's very common. And I experience it myself. I have several kids, and it's my biggest fear is that I will get sick and die like my parents did. So, and I'm the same. I'll get like a weird pain in my head or something in my side. And my first thought is like, I have cancer, I'm going to die.
Yep.
And so that's very common with a lot of the people I work with. I think when you lose someone to a long illness and you watch the way illness moves through a body, it's very traumatizing mm-hmm. in some ways. And then also losing someone your age, a sister, a friend. I mean, that is very jarring. You start to realize that like, oh, that could be me.
Yeah. So, well, I'm a big believer in finding an outlet, and you've talked about your writing, and in my case, I produced a documentary about my parents. When my dad was diagnosed, I wanted to get some stuff on tape or on film, I guess. Tape is an old school term, but I wanted to get some stuff with him before he passed. And I got a bunch of footage of my sister too. And that's where GWG came from.
That's
amazing. I
amazing.
wanted to find an outlet. In your case, you turned to writing, and I understand that you recommend writing for other people too. And you recommend that they tell their story. What would you say to somebody who might think, well, I'm not a writer, or that's just not something that I'm comfortable with?
Yeah, a lot of people get a little nervous about writing. It doesn't have to be for anyone except yourself, is what I always say. There's different ways to write with grief. I think doing some like daily writing is wonderful. It's a way, especially if you're going through a recent loss and you have a busy life where you have to get up and go to work, or you have to take care of kids, and all day that grief is kind of sitting in you. And it's so hard to do that and to live your regular life. So just getting up in the morning and writing some of your feelings out can help you kind of get through the rest of your day. So that's one form. Another thing is really telling your story, finding some kind of outlet if that feels good. Grief feels so lonely. We want other people to connect with us. We want to share about the people that we loved and lost. There are really cool forums for that online. Modernloss.com is one I really recommend. And then the third form that I think is really important is writing letters to the people that we've lost. It's really powerful. You think like, oh, okay, it's kind of like talking to them in your head, and it's not. You sit down and you write that like, dear Dad, here's how I'm doing. Here's what's happened since I last saw you. Here's how much I miss you. And it just opens up this part of you that has been yearning to connect with them. We lose someone like a parent, a sister, this person that's been in our life all of our life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to go from having that relationship and then not talking to them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we should talk to them, like it's so painful to suppress that urge to not, or to speak with them. So I think writing letters is a really beautiful way to do that.
Interesting. Yeah. I still have my WhatsApp chat open with my sister. And I found out that her number, somebody else has since taken the number, but I still have the chat. So every now and then I go back and look at it,
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this earlier about how, there's kind of this mentality when somebody passes to just kind of pack it away and just kind of move forward and not really talk about it. And I have a similar mentality to you. I like talking about my father. I like talking about my sister. I got this big display case on my wall with items of their clothing in it and their pictures in it. And I like to remember. I want my kids to remember them. In your situation, I understand that your kids never got to meet your parents, but you keep their memory alive too. And I've even heard about you doing ceremonies for lost pets in the backyard.
Yeah, I think it's probably a certain kind of experience to grow up with a grief therapist as a mom. We talk a lot about death in our house, and we have a lot of like fish funerals. I think I have a goldfish and a Ziploc in the freezer right now. We're overdue for it. We've had a lot of rain lately, so I didn't want to bury it yet. But I think it's important. I think that if we could do a better job of talking about grief and loss at a young age, it would help us when we have to move through it. Inevitably, we're all going to go through grief and loss, and it can be just a really confusing experience initially, and people don't know where to turn, and they don't know how to process it or internalize it or how to talk about it. So I think if we could start doing that at an earlier age and as a culture, it would be a lot healthier and more helpful. But yeah, my kids have never met my parents, which is heartbreaking, but also I feel like I have talked about them so much that they are part of our lives. Right. I reference them all the time. I do things with my girls and tell them like, this is how, your grandmother did this, and she taught me how to make this. And we celebrate their birthdays every year. My kids make my mom a huge cake on her birthday and like decorate it all crazy and sing happy birthday to her. And
nice.
Things like that. And it helps. It helps me. It helps them. I think it's really beautiful.
I agree. I have a 4-year-old, and my father passed 2.5 years ago. So there's no way that he would remember him, but he still to this day will mention his Opa. He does it a lot. And it's because I do talk about him a lot, so I agree with you. I want to ask about this. So when people think of grief, they obviously think of loss. But grief comes in other forms too. It could be a mental health challenge, could be a physical health challenge. And right now we're still in the midst of COVID. And there's been a lot of stories about people dealing with depression because they're stuck locked down, a lot of them alone. The CDC says that drug overdose deaths are spiking during this time. What would you say to someone who maybe they don't recognize that they need help, or maybe they just flat out say that they don't want help? even though they might during this time. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I think in the last year, it's been a really interesting thing. All of us have gone through some form of loss in the last year. Even if you don't recognize it quite for yourself, there isn't anyone who hasn't been touched by this and lost something, loss of a job, loss of health, lost a person, lost, your kids being home from school, lost like canceling a wedding or whatever it is. So many things. We lost a whole way of life. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's important to honor that, to recognize it, to grieve for it. And I think when we don't, people find themselves very irritable. They find themselves, angry for no reason or pinning it on different things. And letting yourself actually just have a minute to reflect on what it is you've lost and let yourself feel all that comes with it can soften a lot of those other emotions. But it takes giving ourselves permission. Western culture, we're not great at letting ourselves be vulnerable. And I think that's even harder for men, just the messages that men get culturally. Mm-hmm. We have to be brave and strong and move through things very quickly and like keep working and all this stuff. And so I think that listening to things like this is really helpful. Just talking about it a little bit with people around you that you love. I mean, I think this last year has been the great wake up call for all of us that life is precious. Things can change in a moment. We should be talking about these things. We should know what matters to us and what would happen if we weren't here tomorrow. What can we put in place for that? The greatest gift you can give a family member is to have your affairs in order. I'm sure you've experienced some of that in your family losses, but sometimes people die and there is nothing that has been put in place,
Yep, for sure. Yeah. For me, it was amazing how helpful it was to have kids. Because it doesn't matter if somebody close to you is sick or if somebody close to you has passed, they still want to watch Paw Patrol. You know what I mean? They still want to go on the swing set. Like mm-hmm. My kids were the greatest distraction. They don't even know it. They were kind of my therapy, I think.
Yeah, no, they are. They're amazing for that. And I think they have this really magical way of looking at the world. So I love to talk to them about death. I like to ask them what they think
really
happens when we die. Ask your 4-year-old. They have really creative ideas that I think we should consider because nobody really knows what happens.
When my wife's grandfather passed and they had a church service for him and they had the open coffin at the front and my daughter was looking at the coffin and I was trying to think of what do I say? I don't want to scare her. So I said, okay, he's a statue now because he has a long trip. And so he's a statue so that he's comfortable and doesn't wake up during the trip. And after that, she would ask questions every now and then about, is Opus still a statue?
That's awesome.
Yeah, they remember,
Yeah.
Well, for more information on Claire and her work, check out her website, clairebidwellsmith.com. And again, her latest book is called Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief, which is available wherever books are sold. And I've been talking to Claire Bidwell Smith. This has been great. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for, making space for these conversations. People need to have a place where they can talk about them and listen. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I appreciate everything you're doing too.